Hi, I'm Keshav,
And I'm Jenna.
and we're presenting That's the Way the Cookie Bounces Syntactic and Semantic Components of Experimentally Elicited Idiom Blends by Cutting and Bock. So, what are idioms? Idioms are phrases with interpretations that are not directly related to their literal meanings. And how are they understood? So, there's a standard pragmatic model, and this says that idioms are stored as whole chunks, like a single word, in an idiom lexicon separate from the general lexicon. In this model, the literal meaning of a phrase is first derived and then checked against its context. If this meaning fails to fit the context, then the idiom lexicon is consulted for the retrieval of the figurative meaning of the idiom. The literal meaning is always determined, and then this determination precedes the figurative interpretation. So, Swinney and Cutler decided to challenge this literal first proposal. They showed that idioms were classified as acceptable English phrases faster than matched control strings. So they said that idioms are in the general lexicon, not in their own idiom lexicon. So basically, idioms are accessed like any other word, literal and figurative meanings occurring simultaneously. So this was the unitization hypothesis, which said that they are in the general lexicon. Now there are two different interpretations: the strong interpretation and the weak interpretation. The strong interpretation says that idiomatic phrases are just a large word-like unit. So the problem with the internal problem with the strong interpretation is that internal components have no identity as individual lexical items, which means they lose information about grammatical class, syntactic structure, and semantics. The interpretation is in question because idiom representations must retain some information about internal components. Now, the weak interpretation says that structural information is retained. So basically, there is a single semantic interpretation for the idiom as a whole, and this solves that little flexibility problem that what happens in the strong interpretation. Now, the decomposability hypothesis suggests that idioms are not single lexical units, either lexically or semantically, but partially analyzable phrases. An example of a decomposable idiom is pop the question. So this is decomposable because its components parts refer in the same way to their idiomatic reference. Pop refers to a sudden noise, and the question refers to a proposal of marriage. So that means this idiom is flexible. Now, an example of a non-decomposable idiom is kick the bucket. There really is not a relationship between the components and their idiomatic meaning in this phrase, so it is just inflexible.
So, experiment 1 intended to determine whether the same and different idiomatic meanings or the same and different syntactic form would restrict idiomatic speech errors. The methods for experiment 1 included 96 Michigan State University undergraduate students and 36 experimental idioms, each with 3 versions. So there was the standard idiom, and then that one that had the same meaning, same syntax, different meaning, same syntax, different meaning, different syntax. And we'll show you examples of these later on. And in addition, there were 16 filler items, and these had the same structure as experimental trials, but the blank screen had a 1 second duration for half and 3 seconds for the other half. And this was done to discourage anticipation of the onset of the probe number. And so the procedure for this experiment included a pair of idioms that were shown on the screen with one idiom on the top and one on the bottom, and followed that was a blank screen for 2 seconds, and then a probe of either 1 or 2 was shown. If the 1 was shown, they had to recall the top idiom aloud and quickly, and if a 2 was shown, they had to recall the bottom idiom aloud and quickly. Following that, they were asked if they responded correctly and had to answer yes or no, and there was 2 seconds in between each trial. So the design for the experiment included each participant receiving one version of each idiom and an equal number of 12 in each of the 3 conditions. Each response was recorded and scored with 6 mutually exclusive categories, and these categories are correct responses, idiom blends, intra-idiom errors, inter-trial errors, complex errors, and miscellaneous responses. So the results for this experiment were that the same syntax, same meaning idiom pairs had a response time that was significantly slower by 33 milliseconds than were pairs with different meanings. And there was a 10 milliseconds difference between the same versus different syntax for the different idiom pairs, but this was not significant. And as you can see in the graph, the same meaning, same syntax had the most blend errors, and there were substitution errors of the same grammatical class, and these occurred most often. So, in conclusion, for experiment 1, production of an idiomatic blend is somewhat sensitive to the internal syntactic structure and to the figurative meaning of the idioms involved. The idiom pairs with the same form tended to blend more than pairs with different forms, and this obeys a grammatical category constraint. And when paired idioms had different structures, there is less support from the syntax due to the absence of structural repetition. And this may allow for the intrusion of lexical items that were semantically or phonologically similar. And experiment 1 argues against the strong unitization hypothesis that idioms are not produced as frozen phrases but are syntactically analyzed.
So as Jenna said before, we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration. We're going to simulate experiment 1. So we're going to follow the same exact procedure that experiment 1 had, and we want you guys at home to be just like the participants and follow along and do what the participants did. So we'll show you 2 different idioms on the screen. Then we'll ask you to recall one of them by giving you a number 1, which corresponds to the top idiom, or a number 2, which corresponds to the bottom idiom. In the real experiment, as soon as the 1 or 2 is presented to the participant, the experimenters will start recording and to see how quickly they responded. But we're obviously not going to do that. But we still want you guys to kind of say it aloud and see if you got it right or wrong. So let's try it. All right, did you get that right? Did you say meet your maker? So meet your maker was the example was an example of a standard idiom, kick the bucket, and same meaning, same syntax, which was meet your maker. Now let's try another one. Did you get it right? Did you say hit the bullseye? Now that was an example of the same idiom and then another idiom with a different meaning but the same syntax. Now let's try another one. Now did you get that one right? That was an example of a different meaning but different syntax.
Okay, now experiment 2. Experiment 2 was to see whether the literal meanings of idioms were active during production. They hypothesized that if idiom production is independent of literal meaning, then there should be no influence of an idiom's literal meaning on the production of idiom errors. On the other hand, if the literal meaning of an idiom does play a role in its use, one would expect to see perturbations from literal meaning similarity in the production of errors. So the methods, they got 96 different Michigan State University students and had the same procedures as experiment 1. Now the design, the participants were showed 4 different types of pairings. One of them was a standard idiom and a literal phrase with the same literal meaning as a standard. For example, hold your tongue, grab your lip. That same standard idiom and a phrase with a different literal meaning, hold your tongue, sign your name, that standard idiom, and an idiom with the same figurative meaning but a different literal meaning, hold your tongue, button your lip, and the standard idiom and an idiom with a different figurative meaning and a different literal meaning, hold your tongue, flip your lid. And these were broken up into blocks and randomly distributed. So the results There was an effective meaning type such that phrases in figurative conditions, idiom pairs, were produced faster than phrases from the literal condition, idiom literal phrase pairs. This difference was significant by both speakers and items. There was no difference between phrases in similar meaning versus different meaning pairs, and the interaction between meaning type and meaning similarity was also not significant. So the discussion. The most important result was that literal meaning similarity between an idiom and a phrase produced as many errors as did figurative meaning similarity. Errors reflect a tendency for similar meanings, either literal or figurative, to interact. The tendency for blending errors to obey the grammatical class constraint held in both the figurative and literal conditions, suggesting that this constraint is blind to whether the blending phrases are idioms. These findings offer evidence that literal meaning is active during the production of idioms. So, kind of in conclusion, phrases with similar meanings produce more blending errors than did phrases with dissimilar meanings, regardless of whether the meaning similarity was literal or figurative.
So, experiment 3 is about decomposable and non-decomposable idioms. In decomposable idioms, the lexical parts of the idiom map onto distinguishable meaning components. It was predicted that decomposable idioms would be more susceptible to the production of idiom blends than non-decomposable idioms would. So for the methods for this experiment, there were 80 Michigan State undergraduate students, and there were idiom pairings taking from the same meaning, same syntax idiom pairs from experiment 1, and this included 10 pairs of decomposable idioms and 10 pairs of non-decomposable idioms, and there are also 40 filler items, and the procedure was the same as experiment 1 and experiment 2. So for the results for this experiment, the naming times were slightly faster for decomposable idiom pairs than non-decomposable ones, but these results are not statistically reliable, and there is no significant difference between the errors made in each type of idiom pair. So lexical representations of decomposable and non-decomposable idioms are the same when they enter into the production process, and this experiment supports a weak version of the unitization hypothesis over the decomposability hypothesis. Okay, so to conclude, in all 3 experiments, idiom blends consistently involve structurally and syntactically similar components, and they found that idioms are phrases with internal syntactic and semantic components rather than lexicalized chunks like large single words. And idioms are idioms because of how they are associated to conceptual representations and how they are represented in the lexicon.
So, because idioms are composed of separate syntactic and semantic components, when the components are similar, they are more likely to blend. This model is very similar to the Dell model we learned about a couple days ago, except that it's been translated to model lexicon for idioms. The model predicts that in production, non-decomposable idioms will be as flexible as decomposable ones because of the syntactic and semantic components coming together.
So limitations of this study were that errors could have been reading errors rather than production errors. That is why after each trial, they asked whether or not they thought they answered correctly to try to account for reading errors. And the results could have been reflecting comprehension more than production processes. And there were also very small differences between production latencies and errors. So, thank you.
Thank you.